an isolated island in the North Atlantic, a place nature never meant for people. The ground cracks open, rivers catch fire, and molten rock waits just beneath the grass. Every disaster the rest of the world dreads, this island lives with. And yet 380,000 people don't just survive here. They've built one of the safest societies on Earth. This is Iceland, and this is how you make a home on the edge of the apocalypse. Drop into a flooded canyon called Silfra, and you can do something impossible almost anywhere else on Earth. Touch 2 continents at once. Press one hand against North America, reach out the other, and you're holding Eurasia. The 2 plates are drifting apart here at about 2 centimeters a year, and this rift is the seam where they separate. The water looks harmless. It isn't. It's glacial melt that has been filtering through porous lava rock for 30 to 100 years before it surfaces, which strips out every particle until visibility runs past 100 meters. You can see a diver the length of a football field away, but that same water sits at 2 degrees Celsius year-round. One bad seal on a dry suit, and the cold hits your chest like a fist. People have gone into shock in seconds, and the rift isn't a metaphor. You can watch it work. Iceland is the only place on Earth where the mid-Atlantic ridge, the longest mountain range on the planet, climbs out of the ocean into daylight. Everywhere else it's hidden 2 kilometers under the sea. Here it runs straight through the country, and the land is quite literally being pulled in 2 directions at once, one half riding toward America, the other toward Europe. The gap it leaves fills with fresh magma that cools into new rock, which means Iceland is one of the youngest surfaces on the planet still under construction. This is also where the nation began. In the year 930, chieftains gathered inside this exact fracture to found the Alþingi, one of the oldest parliaments in the world. They stood in the gap between 2 continents and decided to build a 3rd thing there, or a country, on the one crack that never stops widening. The thing tearing the island apart is the same thing that built it. Iceland's deadliest water isn't the sea, it's the flood the locals call a jökulhlaup, and it starts where you'd least expect it, under a glacier. Here's the mechanism. A volcano erupts beneath the ice cap. The heat melts the base of the glacier from below, and the meltwater pools in a hidden lake, trapped under hundreds of meters of frozen weight. For weeks, the lake grows and the pressure climbs until the water finally lifts the ice enough to force a path out underneath it. Then the seal breaks. Everything the volcano melted comes out at once, a churning wall of gray water dragging icebergs and house-sized boulders, moving fast enough to carve new channels across the plain. At its peak, a large jökulhlaup can discharge water at a rate that rivals the mouth of the Amazon, and it does it not over days but in a matter of hours. In 1996, an eruption under Vatnajökull did exactly this. The flood tore across the black sand plain of Skeiðarársandur and ripped away sections of the country's main highway like they were paper. So Iceland stopped trying to win. Along the routes a jökulhlaup can take, they build bridges designed to be sacrificed, cheap spans meant to wash away so the rest of the road survives, with sensors upstream watching the ice for the first sign. They don't stop the flood, they plan to lose to it on their own terms. And water is only the beginning. The ground itself is keeping a 400-year clock. For 800 years, the Reykjanes Peninsula slept. The fishing towns, the power plants, the road from the airport to the capital, all of it was built on the assumption that the fire underneath had gone quiet for good. The warning came first, the way it always does here, as earthquakes. Late in 2019, the ground near the capital started shaking, small at first, then relentless. By early 2021, the region had been hit by more than 40,000 earthquakes in a matter of weeks. A swarm that told geologists magma was forcing its way up through the crust just kilometers below. Then in March 2021, the ground opened. A fissure tore across Fagradalsfjall and a glowing curtain of lava fountained into the air, the first eruption on that peninsula in 8 centuries. Then came 2022, then 2023, with the activity migrating southwest, closing in on the towns. Geologists reading the old eruption cycles in layers of ash say this isn't a single event. It's the start of a rhythm that could run anywhere from 200 to 400 years, a volcanic marathon that last played out when Vikings walked these shores. But this time, the island is fighting back. When lava started creeping toward towns, engineers did something no modern nation had tried. Using flood simulation software originally built for the US Navy, they modeled where the molten rock would flow next, then bulldozed walls of compacted basalt up to 24 meters high, not to stop the lava, but to steer it. A barrier doesn't have to block a river of fire, it just has to point it somewhere else. In late 2024, they made the call to sacrifice the Blue Lagoon's parking lot to save the power station behind it. They can't protect everything, so they choose what lives. Reynisfjara is the most beautiful beach in Iceland. It's also the one most likely to kill you. The sand is volcanic black. Hexagonal basalt columns rise at one end like a staircase built by something that no longer exists. Tourists climb them for the photo, then they turn their backs on the water. And that's the mistake. Reynisfjara is famous for what locals call sneaker waves. The sea looks flat, ordinary, safe. Then a single wave surges up the beach with no warning and no sound, far higher and faster than the ones before it, and drags whatever it reaches back into the North Atlantic. The water here is a few degrees above freezing, and the current is vicious. Since 2007, it has pulled at least 6 people off these rocks and out to sea, and the Atlantic is so cold and so strong that even the Coast Guard often can't reach them in time. What makes the sneaker wave so lethal is that it breaks the pattern your brain is trusting. You watch the surf for a few minutes, you learn its reach, you step to where it hasn't touched, and that reading is exactly what kills you, because the wave that matters is the one that ignores the average. Iceland has since planted a warning system right on the sand, colored lights that shift from green to red with the sea state, a machine standing where instinct fails, telling you when the calm is lying. Because the ocean here is honest about one thing only: it will not warn you itself. Deep inside Vatnajökull, the largest glacier in Europe, there are caves no human carved. Meltwater bores them out. In summer, water tunnels down through the ice and hollows out passages. When winter locks the glacier solid, for a few months you can walk inside. The blue is the part that doesn't look real. Not pale blue, electric blue, the kind that seems lit from within. It happens because the ice is so old and so compressed that the air bubbles are gone, so light sinks deep, loses its red, and comes back as pure color. Standing in it feels like being inside a sapphire, but this cathedral is alive, and it's moving. The glacier is a river of ice creeping downhill under its own weight, and the caves creep with it. The walls flex, meltwater keeps widening the roof from the inside, and a passage that held all winter can crack and collapse under the millions of tons pressing down from above. The window is narrow and it moves every year. Too early in autumn and the ice is still melting and unstable. Too late in spring and it's already coming apart. What is a wonder in January can be a sealed tomb by April. So Icelanders go in only in the deep cold, and only with guides who read the ice the way sailors read weather, checking the temperature, the meltwater, the fresh cracks, because the beauty here has an expiration date, and stepping past it costs everything. Ice can crush you in silence. But in 1783, it was the air itself that turned to poison. In the summer of 1783, a fissure called Laki split open and did not close for 8 months. It produced the largest lava flow in recorded human history. But the lava wasn't what did the killing. The eruption released roughly 120 million tons of sulfur dioxide. It rose mixed with the air and settled over Europe as a dry, choking fog that stretched from Iceland to Syria. Crops withered under it, livestock died breathing it. In Iceland itself, the famine that followed killed around 9,000 people, 1 in 5 of everyone on the island. Across the continent, the poisoned fog wrecked harvests, and in France, the grain failed and bread prices climbed out of reach. Historians increasingly connect that hunger to the unrest that boiled over into the French Revolution in 1789. One volcano in the North Atlantic helped shake a throne 2,000 kilometers away. What's remarkable is how Iceland turned even that horror into a tool. Every eruption leaves a fingerprint, a thin layer of volcanic ash with its own precise chemical signature sealed into the soil and lake beds. By dating those layers, scientists can reconstruct the exact timing of eruptions going back thousands of years and pair it with the Vikings' own written records of fire coming out of the sea. Folklore and geology checking each other. That's how they know the current cycle is on schedule, and here is the turn Iceland always seems to find. The lava that poisoned the country cooled into some of the most fertile soil it has, now buried under a 1,000-year-old carpet of green moss so soft it looks like another world. The disaster taught them to watch the air, which is why, when Holaron released its own flood of gas in 2014, the country was tracking the sulfur in real time and telling people when to stay inside. In Iceland, the wind doesn't just blow, it attacks. Storms here regularly send gusts past 100 kilometers an hour, and the big ones climb well beyond that, strong enough to shove a car sideways across a road or tear a door off its hinges the second you open it. Rental companies warn drivers never to face a door into the wind, because the gust will bend it back until it breaks. But the wind alone isn't the worst of it. On the black sand plains of the south, it picks up volcanic grit and ash and turns the air into a sandblaster. A single storm can strip the paint clean off a car, etch the glass, and leave the body bare metal. Repainting runs into thousands of dollars, and standard insurance won't touch it. Sand and ash damage is its own separate policy here because it happens that often. The reason the wind gets this violent is the island's own shape. Iceland sits where the warm, wet air of the Atlantic slams into a wall of glaciers and highlands, and the pressure systems that spin up around it can tighten into something close to a hurricane. There are gusts on record here strong enough to flip small aircraft on the tarmac. Locals have a rule tourists learn the hard way. In a real storm, you don't fight it. You pull over, point the car into the wind, and wait. Because the gust that rips a door away is the same one that will roll a vehicle that turns broadside to it. And yet the same wind that flays steel is why Iceland's air is some of the cleanest on Earth, and why that airborne sand builds and reshapes whole black deserts across the south. So people check the wind forecast the way others check the time. Because on this island, the sky is one more thing you learn to read before it reads you. The wind scours the surface bare, and on one island offshore, that emptiness is guarded like a crime scene. In November 1963, fishermen off the south coast saw smoke rising from open ocean. An undersea volcano had broken the surface, and for the next 4 years it kept erupting, building an island out of nothing. They named it Surtsey. It is the youngest land on the planet, and almost no one is allowed to set foot on it. Surtsey is sealed off. A rare chance to watch life colonize sterile ground from absolute zero with a known birthday and no human interference. Only a handful of scientists ever land, and they come scrubbed and checked because the experiment is that fragile. A single seed carried in on a boot, a stray scrap of food, could seed the island with something that was never supposed to be there and corrupt the record forever. Once, researchers found a green tomato plant sprouting from human waste and pulled it out immediately. An entire new world off limits to the species watching it. Iceland guards its most violent creation like treasure, because on the deadest fresh rock on Earth, they get to see exactly how life begins. A brand new island where humans are forbidden. Would you break the rule to stand on New Earth? Beneath the lava fields of western Iceland runs a tunnel carved by an ancient river of magma. It's called Surtsey, nearly a mile of black, cold, sunless passage, and for centuries it carried a grim reputation. To understand why anyone would live down here, you have to understand what banishment meant. In medieval Iceland, there was no prison system and no police. The harshest sentence the assembly could hand down was full outlawry, which stripped a man of all legal protection. Anyone could kill him with no consequence. For the outlaw, that left one option: disappear. Since at least the 18th century, Surtsey has been remembered as exactly that kind of refuge. A hideout where the cast-out sheltered in the dark and raided the farms above for livestock to survive the winters. The old sagas back the reputation with something worse. The Sturlunga saga records that in 1236, a chieftain's son was captured, dragged to Surtsey, and left bound at the top of its stone fortress for dead. But newer archaeology complicates the story. There's strong evidence the cave was also a ritual site in the Viking Age, a place people traveled deep into the earth to visit after catastrophic eruptions, as if to answer the fire directly. Refuge, prison, and shrine, all in the same darkness underground. For the banished, these caves were the end of the line. For everyone else on the island, survival came down to something far thinner: a single road. There is essentially one road that ties Iceland together. Route 1, the Ring Road, loops the entire island, roughly 1,300 kilometers, linking the scattered towns to each other and to the wider world. Finish it, and you understand how much rests on so little, because that lifeline is fragile by design. It runs across the Black Plain where the Jökulhlaup floods come through. The very stretch where the 1996 flood tore out the Skatera Bridge. Much of it narrows to a single lane. Out in the remote fjords, whole sections simply close for the winter. A blizzard, a landslide of ice, or a lava flow across the asphalt can sever a town from everyone else overnight, and it does. One storm, and a community wakes up alone. So the island built a human backstop. When the road cuts a town off, it's neighbors who come, the volunteer rescue teams, ordinary people who leave their jobs mid-shift, pull on gear, and drive straight into the blizzard for strangers free of charge. A teacher, a baker, a dentist in the same rescue truck at 2 in the morning. It isn't charity, and it isn't heroics as they tell it. It's a pact written over generations. Because on a land that can take a life in hours, the person you dig out of a snowdrift today is the reason someone comes looking for your children tomorrow. And behind them stands the Met Office, closing the road before the worst arrives, reading the storm early enough to keep people off it in the first place. The thinnest thread on the island is the one they guard hardest. Fact 11. The 400-year-old beast that carries its own poison. In the cold water around Iceland swims the longest-lived vertebrate on Earth. The Greenland shark grows about a centimeter a year and can live somewhere between 250 and 500 years. One confirmed individual dated to around 400. A shark alive today may have been born before the telescope was invented. Its flesh is loaded with a natural antifreeze, high levels of urea, and a compound called TMAO that let it survive the deep cold. Eaten fresh, that meat is toxic enough to make a person violently ill, which should have made it useless. Instead, the old Icelanders turned it into food. They buried the shark to ferment it, then hung it to dry for months until the poison broke down, and what came out the other side was hakarl, a cured delicacy so pungent it's practically a dare, still served today with a shot of the local schnapps. They took a creature that could poison them and made it a meal that outlasts winter. On this island, even the toxins get put to work. For all its ash and fire, Iceland holds some of the cleanest water in the world, and the two facts are the same fact. Rain and glacial melt sink into the ground and spend decades, sometimes a full century, seeping down through layers of porous basalt and volcanic rock. That stone is a filter the size of a country. By the time the water resurfaces in a spring, every impurity is gone, clear enough to see through 100 meters of it. People here don't buy bottled water. They kneel at a stream and drink, and they use that same restless ground to cook. In the geothermal fields, bakers bury a sealed pot of rye dough in the hot black sand near a boiling spring, where the earth holds a steady heat around 95 degrees. They leave it for 24 hours, no oven, no flame. They dig up a loaf of dense, sweet bread baked entirely by the planet, Verabrod, bread from the hot springs. The same underground heat that filters their water bakes their bread. On an island trying to kill them, the ground quietly feeds them instead. Icelanders took the most dangerous thing under their feet, pockets of magma heating the crust, and turned it into a way of living almost no one else has. Around 90% of homes on the island are heated by geothermal water piped straight from the ground. It travels for dozens of kilometers from geothermal plants, piped through whole neighborhoods, under the sidewalks to melt the snow, and up through the floors of homes so that people walk barefoot indoors while it's below freezing outside. And it feeds a national obsession the locals treat as completely ordinary, bathing outdoors in the open all year. In many towns, the community's real living room isn't a cafe or a pub. It's a steaming geothermal hot tub. Below freezing outside, the wind howling, snow on the ground, and neighbors sink into hot mineral water up to their shoulders with a drink in hand and talk until the cold stops mattering. It's where the town catches up, argues, gossips, makes peace. The steam does the work a fireplace does everywhere else, except it comes straight up out of the same ground that's trying to erupt. Even the country's most famous spa was an accident of this same logic. The Blue Lagoon started as runoff from a geothermal power plant, waste water pooling in a lava field until people discovered the mineral water healed their skin, and a byproduct became a wonder of the world. The thing that could erase these towns is piped into their homes to keep them warm. Isolation in the middle of the ocean cost Iceland a great deal. It also handed them something no other modern nation can claim: a language that barely aged. The Vikings settled here around the year 874, and the Icelandic they spoke has drifted so little in the 1,000 years since that an ordinary person today can pick up a medieval saga written in Old Norse and read their ancestors' words without a translator. Think about how far English has moved in the same window. An English speaker can barely parse Chaucer from 600 years ago, and Old English from 1,000 years back reads like a foreign language. Icelandic simply didn't move like that. When new technology arrives, they refuse to borrow a foreign word for it. A committee coins a new one from Old Norse roots instead. The word for computer fuses the words for number and prophetess, a number seer. The language stays sealed and whole. A modern Icelander and a Viking poet dropped into the same room could understand each other across 1,000 years of history, on the most violent ground on the planet where the map itself keeps rewriting. One thing refused to change: the words. Isolation looked like a sentence. It turned out to be an unbroken thread back to the beginning, 1,000 years of the same language on the deadliest land on Earth, and somehow the safest society too. Here is the fact that shouldn't make sense. The country sitting on the most violent geology on Earth is also the most peaceful society on it. Iceland has topped the Global Peace Index for years running. The police don't carry guns, just batons and pepper spray. There is no army. Violent crime is so rare that parents leave babies asleep in prams on the sidewalk outside a cafe while they sit inside in the cold. And the reason traces straight back to the volcanoes. When you live your whole life beside an apocalypse, you can't afford panic or mistrust. So the island built the opposite, a culture of early warning, deep faith in its institutions, and evacuations that run without chaos. Grindavik emptied thousands of people days before the ground gave way and no one died. Ask an Icelander about the volcanoes and they'll shrug. For them, it isn't a monster waiting to strike. It's just a way of life. They have a phrase for it, Þetta Reddast. It will all work out, not blind optimism, but a belief forged by 1,000 years of reading a land that is always trying to kill them. Iceland never beat the apocalypse. It tamed it. The line between a dead world and a home was never about how gentle the nature was. It was about learning to read it before it moves. So here's the real question, and it's the one Icelanders answer with a shrug every single day. The rest of the world fears these disasters. Iceland built the most peaceful place on Earth right on top of them. Could you live like that, wait on ground that splits, floods, and burns on schedule, trusting that if you read the signs early enough, it works out? Tell me in the comments where you land. Could you make a home on an island that's rehearsing for the end of the world? And if you're watching from Iceland, I want to hear it from you. What's the one thing outsiders always get wrong about living there? If this changed the way you see that little island on the map, subscribe and stick around. Next, we're going somewhere the ground doesn't try to kill you. It just refuses to let you leave.